It is now 1:01 p.m. I will go to Parliamentarian Johnson so that she can establish a roll call for quorum. Parliamentarian Johnson?
Yes, thank you. Chair Moore, Vice Chair Brown, Member Bradford, Member Grills,
Present.
Member Holder, Member Jones Sawyer, Member Lewis.
Present.
Okay, I'll go back. Hold on a moment. Member Lewis,
Present.
Member Brown. I'm sorry, Vice Chair Brown.
Present.
Yes, thank you. Member Tamaki.
Here.
And Member Montgomery Stepp.
Here.
Thank you. Madam Chair, the task force consists of 9 members. 5 members were needed for a quorum. There are 5 members present. We have a quorum is reestablished.
Thank you, Parliamentarian Johnson. Given that a quorum has been reestablished, the meeting is now called back into order. We will now go to our next agenda item, which is witness panel number 4 on physical health. So one of our expert witnesses had an emergency, so she will no longer be able to attend. But I will now go into introducing our esteemed speakers. One moment, please. The first expert witness we'll be hearing from is Dr. Joan Kaufman. Dr. Joan Kaufman is Director of Research at the Center for Child and Family Traumatic Stress at Kennedy Krieger Institute. She also holds appointments in the Department of Psychiatry and the School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Kaufman received her PhD in clinical psychology from Yale University, where she served on faculty in the Department of Psychiatry from 1998 to 2015. In 2015, she was recruited to Baltimore to serve as Director of Research at the Center for Child and Family Traumatic Stress at Kennedy Krieger Institute. She also holds an appointment as a professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and in the Division of Mental Health at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. Kaufman's research is in the area of child abuse and neglect, spans from neurobiology to social policy, and uses tools from psychology, genetics, and neuroscience to understand resilience and mechanisms of disease risk associated with early adversity. She has received consistent funding from the National Institute of Health for her research and has published over 100 peer-reviewed professional articles and book chapters. We'll also hear from Dr. Christopher Kuzawa. Dr. Christopher Kuzawa is a biological anthropologist with training in epidemiology. His research focuses on the role that the intrauterine and early postnatal environments have on the development and long-term health. The premise of this research, supported by studies in both human populations and animal models, is that what a mother eats during pregnancy, her access to adequate prenatal care, or her level of stress may permanently affect offspring biology in a fashion that influences risk for the most common causes of adult morbidity and mortality, including hypertension, diabetes, and heart attacks. This is a novel example of what is known as developmental plasticity, or the sensitivity of the developing body to the environment experienced during early stages of development. Dr. Kuzawa graduated from the University of Colorado at Boulder with a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology from Emory University with a PhD in anthropology and a MS-PH in epidemiology after conducting postdoctoral research in cardiovascular epidemiology at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Kazawa joined the Faculty of Anthropology at Northwestern University in 2023, where he is also a fellow of the Institute for Policy Research. He also has a long-standing interest in how social inequality affects biology and health, and he co-directs the Health Inequality Network of the Human Capital and Economic Opportunity Working Group. We'll also hear from Nkem Ndofo. Nkem Ndofo is the founder and president of Lumos Transforms and creator of the Resilience Toolkit, a model that promotes embodied self-awareness and self-regulation in an ecologically sensitive framework and social justice context. Licensed as a nurse midwife, Nkem also has extensive postgraduate training in complementary health modalities and emotional therapies. She brings an abundance of experience as a clinician, educator, consultant, and community strategist to innovate programs that address stress and trauma and build resilience for individuals, organizations, and communities across sectors. Both in her home country and internationally, Nkem is particularly interested in working alongside most people impacted by violence and marginalization. So without further ado, we will turn to Dr. Kaufman. And Dr. Kaufman, you may begin your expert testimony when you're ready. Thank you very much.
Actually, Dr. Kazawa was going to go first. There was a switch in the agenda. So hopefully that's still okay.
Yes, that is perfectly fine.
Great.
Dr. Kazawa, go ahead.
Can you see my slides?
No, we don't.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
I don't want these slides.
You can hear me, okay. And then I did share it. Let me just make sure it's working. Can you see them?
No.
Hello, can you hear or see me?
We can hear you and we can see you, but we cannot see your slides at the moment.
Ah, okay. Let's, here we go. This will do it. Does that work?
Yes, that works.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to the Reparations Task Force today about the topic of physical health. And physical health clearly has to be a big part of this argument and this story. As a little bit of a refresher, at birth, a female African American in this country has a life expectancy about 3 years less than a white counterpart, and that difference is even more stark for males. It's about 4.5 year different in life expectancy. Remarkable statistics. And what underlies this? Well, a lot of long-term chronic conditions like hypertension, obesity, kidney disease, heart disease, low birth weight, and so on. And here are differences in hypertension by groups, right? So here you see African American versus other groups, notably higher, right? Now, before we proceed and have this conversation as part of this panel, I think it's important to keep in mind that genes are not a cause of these race-based health inequalities that we see here in the United States. I think many of us Americans are socialized into thinking of race as a kind of indelible property of individuals that's sort of inscripted in our genes. And that's just not how it works, and that's not what the genetic data say. And let me give you an illustration of this. So if we think about all of the genetic variability on the planet, all the human genes that are out there, if there were races, you would expect them to cluster into racial groups, sort of like this picture here, right? With some overlap, but relatively distinct from one another. What the genetic data actually show is something more like this, where European and Asian genetic variability is a smaller subset of the original African variability. And this makes a lot of sense if we think about the history and the sort of evolution of our species. Modern humans evolved about 200,000 years ago in Africa. There's been a lot of time for diversification, right? Different language groups and cultures and so forth to, for genetic variability to emerge over that time frame. And then about 50, 60,000 years ago, groups started to migrate out up the Nile Valley or up the coast and populate Europe and Asia. right? But clearly they're just taking pockets of that original variability, and that is why the diagram looks like this, as opposed to a kind of racial diagram as people would conventionally think of it. So the idea of genetic race just doesn't stand up. As important, if not more so, is the fact that when we look within countries, how people are categorized into groups, and in the United States into races, is a product of local, historical, political, social forces, and it's not based in genetics, right? And in the United States, we're all very familiar with this. Obama made, of course, incredible headlines by being the first Black president, right? But if we look back here at our future first Black president, here he is with his grandparents, and here he is with his mother, a European descent woman from Kansas, right? But because we live in a society where any indication of having non-white ancestry at all puts you into that non-white category, the fact that he has a Kenyan father makes Obama classified as Black in this society. And this one drop rule, I think, just illustrates how when we talk about race, it's a social construct. It's not based in something genetic and objective. Okay. Now, what I'm not arguing for is that genes don't matter to our biology, because clearly they do. There isn't a trait on my body that isn't influenced by genes. But there's no evidence that genes account for why one group is over here and another group is down here, okay, when it comes to health inequality in this country. Here's a study that pooled all the data on genetics and racial disparities a couple years ago, and the authors concluded the accumulated evidence for genetic contributions to cardiovascular disease disparities in Blacks versus whites has been essentially nil. A more recent study, 2020, published in the Journal of American Medical Association Cardiology, large study, 2,500 individuals and so on, and again, adds to the existing evidence against the genetic basis for population level racial disparities. So genes are not a part of this story. What we do know is that health inequality traces to things like income, educational opportunities, differences in discrimination and racism, healthcare access, and so on. It's these social factors that drive the health and the biological differences. So that's what we've known for a long time, that those chronic differences in experience and things like stress and discrimination and so on are going to drive health inequality in the country. But what I want to talk about today for the rest of my talk, I'm going to add to that story, okay, and talk about some work that's been done in the last couple decades that's showing that experiences early in life, starting in utero and continuing into infancy, can lead to durable biological changes that also influence health across the life cycle. So this is another complementary piece of evidence for this social determinant story. I'm going to start with just a little bit of the work that we've done in the Philippines on this topic. I've been working there for about 25 years. And this graph here, what it shows is we're breaking the population down on the basis of their waist circumference, how much body fat they have around their belly. And those who have the most body fat have the highest insulin levels, so that they have the highest risk for diabetes, as you would expect. Here we break it down further on the basis of their birth weight, right? And so the light bars are the lowest birth weight individuals. And you can see that the folks who are relatively light as adults, their birth weight doesn't matter that much, matters a little more for those in the third quartile. And those who are heaviest as adults, it matters quite a bit. And in this sample, in this population, the folks with the highest risk for diabetes are those who are born small, born thin, but then go on to gain weight and become heavy as adults, right? And the difference across those birth weight groups is about 25%. So it's a fairly substantial impact. What this finding is an example of is a field called the Developmental Origins of Health and Disease. It goes by the acronym DOHAD. The basic idea here is that the roots of adult health trace in part to experiences during intrauterine and early postnatal life. And this is an important part of this overall story of the social origins of health inequality in this country. Well, where did this idea come from? Well, starting in the 80s, late 80s and early 90s in Britain, studies started to come out showing relationships like this. Lower birth weight individuals had higher risk heart attack as adults. And that inspired this idea, a model in which a fetus that's stressed or undernourished is going to slow its growth rate, and you're going to get a low birth weight as a result of that. That we've known. But what's new is the idea that the fetus is also changing all these aspects of its biology, how it handles cholesterol, glucose, where it puts fat on the body, blood pressure regulation, immune function, and all sorts of things, stress biology. These are relatively durable, okay, and they persist into later life to influence risk for cardiovascular disease. Now, everything I've shown you so far is birth weight, which is a very crude marker of prenatal nutrition, but animal work, okay, that is more experimental, replicates these findings. So this happens to be guinea pigs, and you can see that this is glucose levels. So this is sort of blood sugar, right? And their fasting glucose levels are here, and then they effectively eat a meal, and their glucose shoots way up, right, after the meal. And then their bodies are producing insulin to remove that glucose from the bloodstream and bring it back down to fasting levels, right? Now, the open circles right here are animals whose mothers had their diet restricted when they were pregnant with them. And you can see that they're clearing their glucose just fine, just like the other animals. But when you look at their insulin, the story is very different. You can see that under fasting conditions, they're overproducing insulin. And then after that meal, they have this exaggerated insulin response. So they're clearing their glucose, but they're having to work a lot harder at it. They're having to overproduce insulin. This shows that their tissues are resistant to the effects of insulin, and that insulin resistance is what leads to diabetes. So this is a nutritional stress imposed on a mother during pregnancy, leading to diabetes in their offspring as adults. All right, so what accounts for this memory, if you will, of this nutritional stress that's happening prenatally? And part of this story, I'm just briefly going to mention it, is what we would call changes in the epigenome or epigenetic changes. And later speakers are also going to talk more about this. What these entail are chemical changes to the chromosomes, right? So you've got the double helix of the DNA. These are little chemical tags onto those chromosomes, which influence which genes are silenced and which genes are turned on. So it's not really changing your DNA or changing your genes, but it's kind of influencing which can be expressed or not. And that can be influenced by the environment, especially early in life, and persist in our bodies as we age to influence health later. All right, so one example of that, I'm not going to go into great detail, but in rats, sort of like what we just saw with guinea pigs, prenatal nutritional stress leads to epigenetic changes in the liver that contribute to adult diabetes. So that's an example of how epigenetics is part of this story. So when we see these very crude relationships in humans with lower birth rate being associated with diabetes, the animal work really suggests that there's something about nutrition prenatally that is driving these relationships. Now, it's not just nutrition. It's also psychosocial stressors that the mother experiences can have very similar effects on biology. I'm just going to show you this very quickly. These are sheep, okay? And here you can see that, again, it's the same sort of thing where glucose is given and you see the insulin going up, right? Just like we saw with the guinea pigs. The control animals, their insulin is down here. But the animals who are exposed to higher levels of the mother's stress hormones during pregnancy, as those being exposed to a psychosocial stress, you can see that they're overproducing insulin, they're insulin resistant like those guinea pigs were. And over here we see the control animals, and here's an animal that's exposed to high levels of stress hormone that has higher blood pressure. Okay, so psychosocial stress also has those kinds of intergenerational effects. So to summarize, developmental biology is sensitive to prenatal and early postnatal conditions. Maternal psychosocial and nutritional stressors lead to durable biological changes in offspring that elevate future risk for cardiovascular and other common diseases. And the implication of all this is that the mother's experiences of environmental stressors can have lingering impacts on adult health in offspring. Now, that's the background. What I'd like to do in the second part of my talk is consider how some of this might play into the issue of race-related health inequality here in the United States. And we already talked about some of the major sources of health inequality, things like heart attack, stroke, diabetes, hypertension, and so on. Well, there are also inequalities in early life, prenatal conditions as well, things like prematurity, low birth weight, and intrauterine growth retardation. So here's a figure showing the disparities in low birth weight, about twice the rate of other groups when you look at African Americans, right? Now, the DOHAD literature that I just showed you raises the question of whether these early life health disparities might in part be setting up risk long-term for some of these adult health disparities. And before we go down that path, again, we have to ask the question, okay, we've got these disparities in birth weight, right? Might that trace to genes? I mean, that's a reasonable question. And there's really no evidence for this, okay? There's a lot of evidence against it, in fact. And so one source of that evidence comes from interracial marriages. If this is about sort of African ancestry genes and the contribution of those to lower birth weight, then you would expect similarly low birth weights if the father is of African ancestry or the mother is of African ancestry. And that's not the case. If the mother is of African ancestry, married to a white father, about much higher rates of low birth weight and very low birth weight compared to if the mother is white and the father is black. So it's something about being black in utero, right, as opposed to a genetic contribution of African ancestry. We also see evidence of this from recent U.S. immigrants to the United States. So these are data from Illinois. And here, this big line here is the white population, right? And you can see their birth weights are here. And this dotted line is African American birth weight distribution. So it's shifted to the left, meaning that the average birth weight is lower. Now, back here, you can almost not see it, is another line that looks just like the white line, and that's African-born blacks, first generation coming from largely from West Africa. Look almost identical to white birth weight distribution. Now, these researchers did something very clever. They went and they tracked down the offspring and the grand offspring of those immigrants, and what they found is that the birth weight distribution quickly started to shift to the left after just a generation or two and start to look more like the African American birth weight distribution. So there's overwhelming evidence that there's something about being black in America that is driving birth weights down. It's not a genetic factor. We know some of the factors that contribute to this. Differences in education, residential segregation, poverty, racism, discrimination, and so forth. The same factors that we already talked about. Here's a study that shows that 3 or more self-reported events of racial discrimination greatly increased odds of giving birth to a low birth weight baby. Black women in this study were about 4 times more likely to give birth to a low birth weight baby compared to white. If you account for discrimination, that's greatly reduced and it's no longer significant, right? So this is the kind of evidence we have for discrimination and factors like that driving those health inequalities. This is an amazing study. This is all births in California, and you see that the likelihood of a low birth weight baby is doubled among ethnically distinctive Arabic-sounding named women in the year after the 9/11 attacks compared to that same group of women the year prior to the 9/11 attack, showing the effects of the kind of systematic racism that occurred after those attacks on low birth weight rates in this particular group. Okay, so let's start to summarize some of this. We have stressors, things like discrimination, racism, and so on. We have positive factors like coping and social capital and buffering that come together to influence the mother's level of stress, which then influences the fetus. Now, what we've known forever, for a long time, is that is going to drive prematurity, intrauterine growth retardation, low birth weight, these kinds of perinatal or neonatal outcomes. The DOHAD literature that I've been talking about shows that the story continues, that there are also going to be health effects on adult health outcomes related to stress biology, blood pressure, and so on, right? And I already showed you some of the evidence for this from places like the UK, from our study in the Philippines. It also works here in the United States, not unexpectedly. Lower birth weight, higher blood pressure, higher cholesterol, higher insulin resistance. This is in black and white participants in Louisiana from the Bogalusa Heart Study. Here's a fascinating study. This was a former student of mine looking at the effects of ethnic discrimination during pregnancy in New Zealand. And more reports of ethnic discrimination, mothers had higher stress hormones, cortisol, during pregnancy. But then what she did is you can actually have babies spit in a tube and measure their hormones from that. So she had them spit in a tube before and after their vaccines, the normal kind of routine vaccinations that they get, which is a stressor, obviously. And what she found is that the kids whose mothers reported discrimination during pregnancy had a much bigger stress response to that stressor of being vaccinated, showing that there are likely intergenerational effects of stress on stress biology in the next generation. Okay, so we have lots of evidence for this kind of long-term effect of early environments on all of these factors here. Now, unfortunately, this story does not end there, because some of these adult outcomes, like changes in stress biology or increases in blood pressure or increases in your circulating level of glucose, these in turn can feed back upon the gestational environment of the next generation, all right, and have impacts on the grand offspring potentially. So here's an example of that. Here we see that hypertension going into pregnancy greatly increases the likelihood of giving birth to an intrauterine growth retarded baby, mild or severe. All right, so we see that low birth weight predicts high blood pressure, but then women with high blood pressure in turn are more likely to give birth to lower birth weight babies in the next generation. So you have this kind of potential for an intergenerational process. Now, so far, I've only talked about the low end of the birth weight distribution, small babies, nutritionally stressed, and so on. But there's also risk associated with being too large. And this is increasingly an issue with the obesity epidemic. And what can happen here is a woman who has uncontrolled diabetes because of obesity, or just because she's diabetic, her glucose levels will be higher, right? And this will cross the placenta, lead to a larger baby that has more baby fat itself, and also will have changes in their metabolism that increase their likelihood of becoming obese and diabetic themselves, increasing the likelihood that they'll be diabetic mothers and pass on the same characteristics to the offspring. Now, this is not simply a story of genetic inheritance. Obviously, genes could be part of this, right? But we have a lot of evidence that it's not. So here's an example of that. We can look at studies where women have gone through gastric bypass, right, where they lose a lot of weight because of a surgical intervention. And before that bypass, when they're obese, 22% of their 12-year-old kids are obese. But then they go through the bypass, they go through the weight loss as a result of gastric bypass, lose weight, and the children born after that, only 3% of them are obese. And not only that, but there are also benefits and improvements to their blood pressure, diabetes, and cholesterol compared to their same-aged siblings, right? So there's really good evidence, I think, for a kind of intergenerational effect, in this case, of being overweight and of weight loss, the benefits of this across generations. So I think there's good evidence that these early life factors are going to set up risk for some of these late life factors, and that not only that, it's going to be a kind of a fading effect, but nonetheless, there is likely going to be some perpetuation of those effects that go beyond that. And we can think of it this way here, where prenatal stressors set up fetal biology in a way that persists into adulthood, that then sets up the gestational environment and so on as a sort of, again, probably a fading effect through time, but nonetheless, this is probably part of the story. Okay, so to wrap up, African Americans have lower average birth weights. Those low birth weights trace to social causes. There's no evidence for genetic contribution to them. And then those low birth weights in the sort of constrained prenatal environment that we've been talking about can lead to adult cardiovascular diseases, right? It also leads to more rapid aging, cognitive decline, many other things that we didn't talk about, but a lot of this work has really focused on cardiovascular disease. Some of these in turn, things like having high blood pressure or high glucose levels, can then adversely impact the gestational environment of the next generation. And then this is the low birth weight end. We also talked about how obesity can kind of beget obesity through a sort of separate but similar kind of pathway that I just talked about. So the take home of all this is that unequal social environments influence racial health inequality cumulatively by a kind of wear and tear, the way that we've traditionally viewed it. But there are also these effects of these life course and intergenerational pathways, these newer pathways, that this is also a part of this story. Now, I think this is an important piece for any case for reparations, okay? Because there's evidence that all of this could be reversed through economic, educational, and residential mobility in this group. So here we see an example of this. African American women who are in the lowest SES quartile, right, and don't sort of stay there statically in the lowest income quartile, you see that 23% of their babies are small for gestational age. But if they have upward economic mobility, right, they move up one quartile, then you see it go down. If they move up 2 quartiles, it goes down further. If they move up to the top quartile, it's drastically reduced, right? So this is for SGA, small for gestational age, but we also see that for preterm birth, for low birth weight. So I think that the developmental origins research that I've been talking about today, that I've been reviewing, shows that policies that improve these newborn, these perinatal, these infant health outcomes are also going to help narrow the racial gap in adult health. So this is partly a story about how health inequality today traces to injustices in the past. That is certainly part of what this is about, but it also shows that policy changes that improve things now are going to have benefits that reverberate into the future as well. And that's all. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kazawa. Now we'll have Dr. Kaufman. You may begin your expert testimony when you're ready.
All right. And can you see and hear me? See my screen?
Yes. Yes.
All right. So we've heard about and again, thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for the time you're taking to look at these issues and really try to move the field forward in addressing reparations in this country. So starting with a thank you. So in the last talk, we've heard a lot about intergenerational transmission. I'm going to be talking about transgenerational epigenetic inheritance and how it relates to systemic racism in the United States. As was discussed last presentation, it's well established that personal experiences of trauma, adversity, and discrimination can get under the skin and increase risk for a whole host of negative mental and physical health problems. There is emerging data now also that confirms negative exposures in one generation can be passed down to affect the health and well-being of future generations through what we call transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. And the notion that there's generational trauma that can be passed on was first acknowledged by a Canadian psychiatrist who saw very elevated rates of anxiety in the children of Holocaust survivors. Since then, people have also found elevated rates of anxiety in the grandchildren, and other types of adversities like exposure to famine or toxins have actually been found to affect the health across multiple generations. So transgenerational epigenetic inheritance is how the negative effects and adversities of traumas in one generation can be passed down to affect the health and well-being of future generations. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren can be negatively impacted by ancestral traumas, even when they have not been directly exposed to any harms themselves. So there's a couple key concepts that I'm going to go over in terms of transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. And some of these, Dr. Carrazza, thank you for introducing the concepts. The first is epigenetic modifications. Those are chemical modifications to the genes that affect the likelihood of a given gene product being made, with gene products being things like proteins and hormones that our bodies need to stay healthy. Epigenetic modifications are not gene mutations. Gene mutations interrupt the codes used to make the gene products, so they may not be built right. Epigenetic modifications just turn genes on and off, but do not affect the codes used to create the gene products. So we already learned how epigenetic mechanisms are one of the ways in which experience of trauma can get under the skin. Okay, for the environmentally induced epigenetic modifications to be inherited across generations, they have to make it to the germline, the sperm and the egg, because those are the only two cells that are going to create subsequent life. Now, most of the research looking at transgenerational epigenetic inheritance has used animal models, and you can control animals in a way that you can't quite control. We don't have really the sort of multi-generational studies where we've looked at these mechanisms, or not very many of them, where we've looked at them in humans. And it's also sometimes hard where some of the experiences that lead to epigenetic changes in one generation are experienced by subsequent generations. So in these animal models, the first generation is called the F0. So that's the animal that's exposed. As we've learned, their offspring can be exposed as well. So if F0 is exposed, F1, the child is considered exposed as well. That's kind of a multi-generational exposure. And that we can't really look at transgenerational epigenetics until the F2 generation, the great-grandchildren. Because the transgenerational epigenetic inheritance requires that the negative outcomes associated with exposure be evident in generations with no history of exposure. So it would be the F2 generation in males, because the F1, the sperm, the egg are, within that body and would have gotten some exposure. If it's a female, it's going to be the F3 generation, because F0 is exposed, F1's eggs are exposed, and F2 is created from the eggs of F1. So you have to get all the way down to the great-grandchild to really call it transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, where negative outcomes despite no exposure.
Dr. Kaufman?
Uh-huh.
Me, your slides are not advancing. Are you advancing your slides?
Really? I am. You're not seeing anything?
Not seeing anything except your first slide, and it's not in play mode. So you have to put it in slideshow?
I am in slideshow on mine, so let's figure out what's not happening correctly on the share.
And then at least we can see them, but now I see a different slide.
You're now on slide 7.
Okay.
So if I go, but then we won't be able to have the animation. So you can see this now, but if I go like this, you can't see me advance. You didn't see that advance?
If
No.
can you click on that slideshow and see what happens?
Yeah, well, I did do this. I don't know if there's a different place to do slideshow from here. Let's see if we try.
Are you running on a Mac?
I am.
You need to put it in slideshow mode first. And then remember we discussed the command tab, and then you have.
Walk me through it. Tell me what you want me to do.
Okay.
So should I put my PowerPoint slide?
So stop sharing.
Okay. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Stop share. Okay, now put your PowerPoint in slideshow mode.
Okay.
Okay, and then go command tab, and you should see across the middle of your screen your different tabs. And then go back to BlueJeans and share screen, share window.
Right.
There you go.
Okay,
Now
I'm
when
really
you-
sorry about that.
That's okay. Now when you advance, you should be able to advance fine.
Okay, should I just sort of start from the beginning again? Does that make sense? I'm sorry that I wasn't aware that wasn't working. All right, I will quickly go through, since I think hearing words without seeing pictures sometimes is a little bit discombobulating. All right, so following up on the last talk, it is well established that personal experiences of trauma, adversity, and discrimination can get under the skin and increase risk for a whole host of negative mental health and physical health problems. Emerging data now also confirms that negative exposures in one generation can be passed down to affect the health and well-being of future generations through what's called transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. And we talked about the notion of transgenerational inheritance initially came from some of the work in Holocaust survivors, but has been shown in terms of exposure to famine, toxins as well. And transgenerational epigenetics is how the negative effects of adversities and traumas in one generation can be passed down to affect the health and well-being of future generations, such that grandchildren and great-grandchildren can be negatively impacted by ancestral traumas, even when they've not been directly exposed to any harms themselves. So some of the key concepts which we've talked about, epigenetic modifications, they're chemical modifications. They affect the likelihood of a given gene product being made, with gene products being things like proteins, hormones, things our bodies need to stay safe. Again, they are not gene mutations. Gene mutations affect the codes that are used to make genes, so the products may not be made right. These epigenetic modifications just turn genes on and off. Epigenetics, as we heard, is one of the ways that adversity can get under the skin. And in order for these environmentally induced epigenetic chemical changes to the genes to be inherited across generations, they have to be in the sperm and the egg, because the sperm and the egg are the only two cells that create subsequent life. All right, so this is the animal model. Yeah, so trying to listen to what I was saying with this animal model without the picture really must have been confusing. So thank you for stopping me. All right, F0 generation is the one that's going to get the exposure. Since the sperm and the eggs are inside that animal, the next generation is considered exposed as well. And true transgenerational inheritance doesn't happen until the F2 generation in the male, or the female if they're not pregnant. If the female is pregnant, F0 is exposed, her eggs are exposed, and then the child that's made from her eggs is considered exposed. It takes all the way to the F3, to the great-grandchildren, to be considered really true transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, so that the F2 and F3 generation will have had no exposures, and that would be our test as to whether we're really getting transmission without any exposure. Okay, so one of the first experiences, so I think this is where we're picking back up, that was able to show, and it's an experiment in something called fear conditioning, which is an animal analog for trauma exposure. So in this first generation, FC generation, shock was paired with an odor. so that after a period of time where every time an animal smells something, they get shocked, just the smell is going to make them have a big fear response. So in doing this, they found that the F1, the children, and the F2 grandchildren had an increased fear response to that smell that the F0 one got shocked for, okay? But they didn't show any fear response to other odors, and they had absolutely no exposure to the odor or to the shocks. So that trauma experience kind of got passed down, even though they themselves had nothing that kind of, no shock experience. These F0 and the F1 mice, are you able to see my cursor when I'm pointing? No one's responding. Well, I'm hoping you can, but I'm not sure if you can.
Yes, we can.
Oh, good. Okay, thank you. So the F0 and the F1 mice who were subject and their offspring, they had epigenetic marks in the sperm and a gene that was critical to smell perception. So again, it kind of highlights this is not a random gene. They get shocked when they have a smell, and we're seeing changes in genes that are involved in smell perception. The F0 conditioning was also associated with changes in brain regions for smell perception, actually in both the F1 and the F2. So this experience of trauma affected the brains of the children and grandchildren. And then to just really demonstrate that it got passed on through the sperm, they did in vitro fertilization experiments where they took sperm from the, traumatized and non-traumatized animals with a neutral egg, created an offspring, and those offspring had those same sort of changes to the brain, even though they had none of the trauma experiences. So one of the first studies showing that experiences of adversity can really be passed on transgenerationally, and that it really does seem to be passed on through the sperm. Another study is looking at, and we've heard a lot about stress during pregnancy and its impact. And so rats were exposed to stress when they were pregnant, and they looked across 4 generations where some were stressed and some were not. And as we saw in humans, stress reduced maternal weight, gestational length, increased maternal glucose levels across the generations. And we also saw that stress decreased birth weight, which we've talked about. But what's also important to see, the effect was actually greatest in the transgenerationally stressed animals. So there was stress in the first generation, but not the next 3 generations. And that great-grandchild had the lowest birth weight. So that we see that the impact of some of these things really can get passed on even when there's not ongoing adversity. In addition, the offspring of prenatally, multi-generationally, and transgenerationally stressed animals had developmental delays, and a multi-generational history of prenatal stress was associated with changes in genes that are implicated in brain plasticity, childbirth, and preterm birth. So again, not random genes that we're seeing changed in association with these multi-generational traumas. And so the documentation of an impact of transgenerational and multi-generational stress on preterm birth is particularly interesting, given that the racial disparities that we have in preterm birth. And there are also findings that even with adequate prenatal care, it doesn't completely reduce the racial disparities, with African American women who engage in adequate prenatal care still at elevated risk for preterm birth. So understanding these mechanisms is important. All right, another study which looked at transgenerational epigenetic inheritance looked at the high-fat diet, and again, this was actually in the males, and there's a lot of information that high-fat diet can impact the health of descendants across multiple generations. So in this study, F0, the first generation of male rats were either fed a high-fat diet or normal chow diet. And the F0 male rats that had the high-fat diet and their F1 offspring had common sperm epigenetic changes in genes that are implicated in glucose homeostasis, insulin sensitivity, and type 2 diabetes. So we are seeing changes once again in key genes through the transmission of early negative exposures. All right, the next study was looking at the transgenerational epigenetic inheritance related to lead exposure. And this study was actually done in zebrafish. And the F0 first generation were exposed to 24 hours of waterborne lead. Then the F0 generation zebrafish were then raised to adulthood, and they looked at F1 and F2, so grandchildren and children, and the grandchildren and children had no direct exposure to the lead. They were then studied. And what we found is that F0 exposed to dosages of lead that they've found, could produce learning impairments. And I have to confess, I have no idea how you do learning experiences with zebrafish, but I'm glad someone knows how to do them. So they had the F0 exposed to an amount of lead that's previously been shown to have lead to learning impairments, and that they found the F2 generation of the F0 exposed fish, who had, again, no direct exposure themselves, had similar learning impairments. So the difficulties in learning were passed on despite the absence of lead exposure in those subsequent generations. The F2 offspring of those F0 exposed zebrafish also had alteration in genes that are involved in brain development and also some epigenetic processes, leading the way to start to understand how lead-induced neurobehavioral deficits, cognitive deficits, and the like may in fact be inherited across generations. So some key summaries. Emerging research confirms that the negative exposures in one generation can be passed down to affect the health and well-being of future generations through transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, the transgenerational transmission, and of these experience-dependent chemical modifications to the genes. And while most of the research to date has been conducted in animals, studies in humans have also shown that ancestors exposed to trauma, poor nutrition, toxic chemicals, as we've discussed, can impact the health of descendants across several generations. And some of those epigenetic modifications that have been noted in animal studies have also been reported in humans. Okay, for the environmentally induced epigenetic modifications to be inherited across generations, they must be contained in the germline, sperm, and eggs, and that's now been demonstrated in multiple studies. The causal significance of these epigenetic changes have been demonstrated. I talked about one in vitro fertilization studies, but there have been others, so really showing kind of causal significance. And then again, the biological relevance of the genes that are regulated by these epigenetic marks really kind of add compelling support for the role of these mechanisms in transmission of experience-dependent traits and health problems. So there's a little bit of an upside. So I'm going to talk about preventing the transmission of the negative effects of ancestral traumas. And I'm probably thinking both personal traumas and ancestral traumas. So the first study we looked at was one of these fear conditioning trauma type experiences where the odor and the shock was paired together. So in the first experiment, you see there's a pairing of, here it's a sound with a shock, and you see that there's a rise in the animal's kind of fear response. And then when you then just give the sound, that animal still has a really heightened fear response. So they've been fear conditioned to the sound of that particular noise. In extinction training, what they do is basically you just hear the sound, and a shock never comes. And eventually, over time, the animal stops having the fear response, so that they can then just hear the sound again, and there's no major fear response. And the notion of extinction training, and why I put treatment there, it's really at the core of most evidence-based treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder. Prolonged exposure. Talk about your trauma, learn relaxation therapy, be able to do cognitive processing, rethink about what happened. And so extinction is really a core part of what our evidence-based treatments are for trauma. So in this study, the first generation, either did or didn't have the extinction training or the treatment. And when the animals had that initial fear conditioning, but they got the treatment, they no longer showed a response of fear to the sound, and they also didn't have changes in the sperm, so that the treatment prevented both the behavioral outcome as well as the changes in the sperm. And what they also found is that it also prevented there being any fear response in the next generation. So both generations stopped showing those behavioral changes. And it does appear that trauma treatment can prevent the transgenerational transmission of the negative effects associated with ancestral traumas. Other studies that they've done that have been shown in animals to prevent the negative effects of ancestral traumas, with the high-fat diet, they've found that Giving a healthy diet and exercise prevented the epigenetic sperm changes and the transmission of obesity and diabetes. Enrichment has been found to be an incredibly powerful thing. So, in the rats, you get all sorts of fun stuff in the cage. So there's the living's enhanced by toys, rich social, physical, and sensory experiences. And that prevented the negative outcomes associated with prenatal stress and lead exposure. All right, so if we take and say, how can we extrapolate this to really prevent, and here I say both the negative effects of personal and ancestral traumas in the human studies. Many of you may or may not be familiar with the Carolina, and I'm not going to probably say it correctly, Aborigine, I'm not sure I'm saying that project, but it's probably one of the most rigorous studies looking at the impact of high quality early education. And this was for kids from 0 to 5. It was a randomized control trial. And the benefits were not just in, the individuals who participated in the program, the offspring of the program. They were found to have fewer school suspensions, less criminal problems, greater educational attainment, employment relative to the children in the control group. So providing outstanding educational enrichment in one generation improved the outcomes of the next generation. You guys are out in California. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Stanford Medical Youth Science Program, but it provides enrichment in the medical sciences and college admission support to very low-income minority high school students, most with poor academic preparation. And to date, there have been, or at least the last published paper had 400 students who've been through this. 99% were admitted to college. And again, they did not have good academic preparation before the program began. 81% earned a 4-year college degree, and among the 4-year college graduates, 52% are attending either graduate or medical school. So really remarkable. I think a lot of times when we think about intervention, we think birth to 3, birth to 5. Point is, adolescence is another period of rapid brain development. We don't want to be forgetting about our older youth when we think about prevention and really the power of these types of enrichment programs and really changing life course. I don't know if you are familiar with Strong African American Families. It was originally developed in rural income African American families, but has since been replicated in multiple urban areas around the country. It's designed to enhance the parent-child relationship, as well as address kind of unique issues related to being an African American youth, like racial socialization, racism. It's a combined intervention. It's usually done where there's a meal served and there's some work that's done with the parents about how do you, monitor and protect your child with youth. How do you focus towards the future, as well as address some of these issues around racism. They've been a very relatively large-scale randomized control trial. And the youth had this program starting at age 11, long-term follow-up into early adulthood. And the outcomes include decreased rates of conduct problems, decreased rates of smoking, drinking, drug use, risky sex behaviors in late adolescence and early adulthood, and reduced risk of obesity and prediabetes in young adulthood. And as we heard, adverse childhood experience are often associated with an increased risk for things like diabetes and all sorts of other health problems. Among the youth who were part of this safe, Strong African American Families intervention, adverse childhood experiences did not increase risk for prediabetes, but among the youth in the control group, each additional adversity was associated with a 37% increased risk for prediabetes. So this intervention really found a way to mitigate the effects of personal adversities. In addition, the intervention was associated with decreasing the impact of family risk factors on all sorts of biological systems, the stress system, inflammation, and epigenetic markers. And it was also associated with diminishing the impact of poverty on hippocampal and amygdala brain volume, which are two main regions of the brain that are impacted by stress. So really highlighting that there's a way in which we can mitigate these negative effects. So preliminary data suggests the negative impact of ancestral traumas can be prevented, and there's a role for trauma-informed services, culturally adapted prevention and intervention programs, and enrichment opportunities are strongly indicated. Just to be, limited time, can't really talk about it, but the reality is that true change and healing, however, requires that the acknowledgement of the harms that were done and broader systemic and policy level changes, because there are many things that perpetuate cycles of disadvantage and adversity. So I think I can stop sharing. Did I stop sharing? I'm good? All right, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kaufman, for your expert testimony. So we'll now go to Nkem Ndofo. Nkem Ndofo, you may begin your expert testimony when you're ready.
Thank you, Chairperson and Task Force members, for this opportunity to present testimony in service of the critical need to develop reparation proposals for African Americans. I will not be showing any slides. A little bit of levity. I don't think at this point in a pandemic we need any more PowerPoints. You all did a beautiful job. So I'm going to really have some connection here around my original training and practice as a mental health, maternal health clinician, specifically as a nurse midwife. And what I recognized in doing that practice was a deep and pervasive impact of trauma, not just on the health of mothers and their infants, but on entire families. So for the last 15 years, I have refocused my work on the topics of stress, trauma, and resiliency in social service, education, and healthcare sectors, with a particular focus on marginalized, vulnerable, and oppressed populations. I primarily serve as a consultant and strategist for trauma-informed and equity-focused organizational development, and as a trainer for professionals willing to, and interested to grow competency in these areas. I am currently leading the Anti-Racism Initiative for the Los Angeles County Department of Health Services, the second largest safety net health system in the United States. I was asked to present my expertise on a particular aspect of racialized trauma that is little talked about, but which is pervasive and insidious in its damage, the phenomenon of appeasement. I will spend a moment defining appeasement, describing some of the physiology before detailing the serious implications for the health and spirits of African Americans. Appeasement is any relational behavior designed to pacify interpersonal threat. Although it exists on a larger continuum of strategies which help us get along with others, these behaviors vary according to the amount of perceived or actual power held by the parties involved. For example, when the power imbalance between people is relatively small, both parties might usefully and comfortably employ negotiation to come to a satisfactory resolution to a disagreement. Only when there are significant power differences does appeasement come into play. Appeasement asks for nothing from the person holding power except that they do not harm us. For the person with less power, appeasement is a survival strategy designed to let us live to fight another day. Appeasement is more than a culturally conditioned response to social hierarchy. Its roots stretch deep into our shared stress biology with other social animals, particularly mammals. I will offer a quick review of stress responses in order to clearly explain what is happening in appeasement and how it is relevant in racialized trauma. And I understand that we have varied degrees of medical training here, so I'm going to use some pretty simple language for accessibility, also for the public testimony, the public participants here. Often when we talk about stress response, we hear the term fight-flight, which describes the activation of the sympathetic nervous system with the resulting state of high adrenaline, coupled with increased blood pressure, blood sugar, and a cascade of other physiological reactions. This state is a normal defense response that is meant to be short-lived before a return to baseline. There is a second and less known stress or trauma response, commonly called a freeze response. This is when a threat is perceived to be so serious that movement to combat or escape the threat is essentially shut down by the autonomic and central nervous system, along with significant changes in the cardiovascular, hormonal, and other body systems. There is a gradient of intensity in this response. At its most extreme end, this is shock. This shock state, if prolonged in mammals, is not compatible with life. as opposed to if it in a reptile, it can last much longer in that state. Due to its intensity, the freeze response is intended for very short-term active reactions to highly threatening situations. So let me bring this to appeasement. In appeasement, there is substantial activation of both of these stress systems, both the fight-flight and the freeze systems simultaneously. However, the fight-flight system is not externally expressed. Instead, in essence, it is put on hold and almost frozen in place, as if hitting the gas of the fight-flight system and the freeze system at the same time. And while appeasement is a normal, natural part of our human response repertoire when confronted with social situations in which none of the other stress responses are seen as viable. In other words, we appease when the nature of the relationship makes escape impossible, defensive attack is not prudent, and playing dead is not realistic. More specifically, we appease in situations where the unequal power relationship is embedded in the life world of the victim. The latitude to fight or flee in response to a stressor or threat is often reserved only for those with significant social privilege, including that of white skin. The ability for a white person who is pulled over by law enforcement for speeding while driving, the ability for this person to argue their case, essentially fighting, is a privilege that is not afforded to Black people in this country. Even the latitude to run away when threatened is not freely given to African Americans. The history of this country to this current time is frequently punctuated over and over and over again by cases of unarmed, non-confrontational, and even fleeing Black people having been killed by law enforcement officers and white mobs enabled by law enforcement officers. These cases live in the hearts and minds and spirits of African Americans as a cautionary tale of the dangers of expressing the biologically driven fight-flight defense response. But this fight-flight response doesn't go away. Instead, it is literally frozen in place through the dual stress system activation of appeasement, which exacts a heavy energetic cost. In these contexts, it's fairly easy to see appeasement as a trauma response and a survival strategy. The appeaser faces a double bind of sorts. If they fully express the fight-flight defense response, they risk potential violence or other harms. But if they simultaneously freeze that fight-flight response in an act of appeasement, then they pay the heavy metabolic cost, the price of that dual stress system activation. This is biology and cultural conditioning influencing one another in both the response and the outcome. And it is not just in cases of interaction with law enforcement where appeasement responses come to bear. Black people face racialized social and power hierarchies in the workplace, in the classroom, and in the community. Black people face racially based threats, intimidations, and negative assumptions on an everyday basis. And the impact goes far beyond feeling hassled or irritated. I think my fellow presenters have done an excellent job of demonstrating that. What I want to highlight is that milder fight-flight and more intense freeze response are intended for short-term use. There is nothing wrong with them. We go up, we come down, short-term use. It is the remembering that a prolonged and pure freeze response is lethal in mammals, but even an extended time in fight-flight states means ongoing secretion of stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, with the attendant rises in blood pressure and blood sugar. And even without any medical training, it is very easy to see how a chronic fight-flight activation, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, could lead to hypertension and diabetes. And also remember that with appeasement, we have that dual activation, right? It's not just the fight-flight, it's also the freeze. So living with these daily experiences of racism induces a chronic overactivation of stress systems, which in turn induces a domino effect on interconnected biological systems that overcompensate and eventually collapse upon themselves. Physiological dysregulation and dysfunction produces widespread pathological changes. And again, my fellow presenters have done a tremendous job at, example in the immune system, we see excessive inflammatory cytokines, autoimmunity, and immune suppression. In the brain, hippocampal atrophy with associated decreased memory of all types. Genetically, telomere shortening indicates accelerated cellular aging. Life expectancy is shortened. The impact of appeasement is compounded by the fact that the escape is largely impossible. Black people must regularly interact with white people as a matter of practical survival. To understand what's going on when Black people engage in appeasement, it's critical that we see racism as continuously traumatic and the abusive intergroup dynamics of racism as a social context in which traumatic entrapment can be experienced and trauma responses should be expected. According to the psychology researcher, Dr. Keltner, quote, appeasement begins when the conditions of social relations lead one individual to anticipate aggression from others, end quote. For African Americans, this means that expressions of modesty, politeness, agreeableness, shyness, uncertainty, and deference may instead be an attempt to deflect or prevent aggression from white people. Essentially, that these behaviors, again, modesty, politeness, agreeableness, shyness, uncertainty, and deference, in the context of intergroup relations with the power hierarchy associated with the privilege of light skin, are expressions of appeasement, can be expressions of appeasement. So when one lives in close and direct contact with members of a dominant social group, appeasing becomes so automatic that the appeaser may not actually even feel distressed in the moment, but instead, the cost comes later. The exhaustion, the chronic ill health across generations, the demoralization, the erosion of one's sense of dignity and self-worth. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kim and Dolfo, for that incredibly moving expert testimony. And thank you again to Dr. Kaufman and Dr. Kuzawa for their incredibly thorough and informed expert testimony. So now we will turn to questions, comments, and insights from our esteemed task force members. So at this time, I would like to turn to our task force members in the event that they have any comments or questions or insights based on the information we all received. And if you like to be recognized, just you can also put it in the chat because I'm not seeing everyone's hand. So I see Member Grills and then Member Sawyer.
Thank you. Thank you to the panelists. This was very, very illuminating and sobering. I'd like to ask a question of Dr. Kaufman. Some people might argue that to try to use epigenetics as a way to substantiate a case for transgenerational harm does not have much legitimacy. And I think in part the argument may have to do with we don't have those all the way to F3 generation. We don't have the great-grandchildren data. So I have a kind of multi-part question. One is it even possible to do that kind of research with human beings? And then secondly, should we throw the baby out with the bathwater if we don't have that, but we do have some fairly compelling animal analog studies?
I would say you shouldn't throw the baby out with bathwater. And the animal studies have been published in the top tier neuroscience journals. So, they are really esteemed, and, careful controls for all sorts of things have happened. Epidemiological study also supports the significance of these, with famine in one generation impacting the health of multiple generations down, even though subsequent generations had normal health. And, there have been some studies where, there was early trauma and then looking at the next generation and seeing some of these same changes. So I think the evidence is compelling, but I think what we also have to recognize, and I think this is what our last presentation was about, trauma didn't stop with the Emancipation Proclamation. We went from that to Jim Crow to lynchings, and then, what we know continues to happen. And I guess, for me, one of the things that I really, as I think about kind of the systems that perpetuate adversity, I think about the criminal justice system, and how that doesn't just impact the person who's behind bars. We know it impacts the entire family. You have a mom who's stressed, who's working 2 jobs. You have a child who's more likely working in a disadvantaged or living in a disadvantaged neighborhood with exposure to lead, inadequate schools, inadequate outdoor spaces, exposure to community violence that just perpetuates that cycle. And we know that even when you get away from all that cycle of disadvantage, you can be the most privileged African American person in this country, and you can't guarantee your child's not going to be pulled over and killed. And so, as we think about it, we know, and, having this history impacts, and that but the point is the trauma hasn't stopped. And so as we think about reparations, the reparations is not just for slavery. The reparations is for a system that's perpetuating and is ongoing with the harm. And, I am always one of these people that how maybe there's a Pollyannish side of me, that there are things we can do, and we want to support those things that we can do. But, also acknowledging the harm, is an important first step, which has not, did I learn about lynchings when I was in school? Did I know 10,000 people would show up? So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Member Reggie Jones Sawyer, you're recognized.
And thank you for the panelists, because for me, I'm really, really interested in this particular topic. About 2 years ago, I heard about trauma-informed care and ACEs, and I decided I would get from the legislature about $50 million to go to nonprofits to deal with trauma-informed care. And as I look at, Dr. Joy's post-traumatic slave syndrome, and I'm looking at her book right now, I remember trying to coin the phrase post-traumatic street disorder, because what happens to young people in the streets, in the projects, is, and I would say could be much worse than being in Afghanistan or being in a war-torn environment. The social workers and psychiatrists went nuts. How dare you? How dare you don't have the ability to make this kind of diagnosis? And it really wasn't me making a diagnosis, it was me trying to get them more money. And I couldn't figure out, was it because I had coined a phrase, post-traumatic PTSD, post-traumatic street disorder? They hated it. Or was it a thing that the monies, and this goes to reparations too, that the monies that I was putting it toward would go to nonprofits based on my terminology, and that they wanted to go to funding for ACEs and trauma-informed care. And they believed that I would be diverting money from what they probably made their living with. That's how exacerbated I was. We came to an understanding that I could use my term, but I also use trauma-informed care and ACEs in my request for $50 million, which I got, and then we were able to distribute to nonprofits. But I worry that we're talking about transgenerational epigenetic transmission, and because as Dr. Brill said, because someone doesn't agree with it or doesn't understand it. As a Black man, I get it, I understand it. but I don't have the prerequisite letters behind my name to justify it. And so I just want to make sure if we as a group make a recommendation that significant funding go to trauma-informed care, post-traumatic slave syndrome or post-traumatic street disorder, if we start to fund that it doesn't get caught up in some bureaucratic quagmire where funding is diverted in programs that may not be specifically for African Americans, and it goes to other folk. And we don't really get to the root causes, which goes back to slavery, and not necessarily what's going on in the inner city, but we understand that the root causes of the problems in the inner city and in the projects and in crime-infested areas go way back to that time. So I don't know if any one of you can kind of address my dilemma.
Well, in terms of the ACEs, people also talk about the expanded ACEs. So that the study in Philadelphia said, okay, we have the ACEs that were developed from a white, predominantly middle-class Kaiser sample, and where they looked at things like community violence as well. Some of those things that, as you say, are the street experiences that can lead to PTSD. And so I think you can use the language of expanded ACEs, which recognizes discrimination, community violence, poverty are some of those adverse experiences that add to negative outcomes across kind of multiple different areas. So I don't know if that frame helps, but expanded ACEs has become also a very popular term, and that we are aware, there's the traditional ACEs, and then there's the kind of and those are more family-based, but there's community-based ACEs are, embedded in those.
Yeah, and I think it's important to kind of separate ACEs, something that's affecting your own experiences early in life and how you kind of carry that forward, versus the transgenerational sorts of processes that Dr. Kaufman was talking about. I think the transgenerational work is extremely exciting. It holds the potential to show that the effects of stress are passed on not just through mothers, but also through fathers. We see it in rats and mice and so on, and it's likely going to be shown in humans. And, Dr. Kaufman did an amazing job of reviewing some of that work. There's even other studies. There's a study that looked at folks who had been exposed, the kids of people who were in POW camps during the Civil War, and those who were in particularly bad situation, they had increased mortality in the next generation, and it's through the father, right? So there's more and more of this kind of evidence, but it is hard to connect it all. But anyway, I just wanted to throw out that when you talk about ACEs, I think that's pretty well established. There's not a whole lot of controversy there in terms of the health effects that's going to have. The transgenerational story is newer, and I think that over the next year or two or three, we're going to see more and more evidence for that, but it's probably a little bit more forward-looking.
I would just like to add, as regularly working in a trauma-informed approach in healthcare and in other disciplines, that often trauma-informed care is scoped as just around the ACEs, and this is a very narrow reading. If we actually look at the SAMHSA definition of trauma-informed care, which includes the clear principles, they include, when you look at it, it includes racialized trauma. So there is no way that you can separate out the experience of what happens within a family outside of the structures and systems that affect the members of that family and the family as a unit. And so true trauma-informed care, I prefer to use the term trauma-informed resilience-oriented, or TIRO, does include racialized trauma and other structural oppressions.
And people are also working now to adapt some evidence-based treatments to specifically address both historical trauma and systemic racism, as part, adding, sort of specifically, so that recognizing it and addressing it.
Member Holder, you're recognized.
Thank you so much for those incredible insights. It's just profound to realize how deep this goes under our skin. I had a question for Dr. Ndefo, and then a question for the panel generally. But for Dr. Ndefo, first, let me say, I don't want to put the onus and the burden again on Black people for having to figure out how to be resilient and come up with all the coping mechanisms. But at the same time, these things are systemic and we have to come up with systemic responses. But at the same time, in terms of our own survival on a daily basis, you described this appeasement dynamic, which I think every African-American person knows exactly what that feels like, how it lands in their body. We've all done it. We all do it. We're doing it right now in this moment. So my question is for you is what are the coping skills that we can use as individuals to take care of ourselves, knowing that this is an ongoing dynamic, and until we have the structures in place to make systemic change, it's going to continue to be an ongoing dynamic. So what are the coping skills that you would suggest, or the tools to disrupt that appeasement dynamic and still stay safe? And then my question to the panel generally is, we're all trying to connect the dots. We're looking at changing systems across the board, and we're hearing from panels on mental health, medical health, etc. And I'm trying to put everything together. And I'm thinking about, the panels that came in earlier and talked about what's happening in medical health and medical training in medical schools, and the fact that most of our training doctors and, the physicians, still have these notions, these biases against Black people, right? And believe that, we have thicker skin, we don't feel as much pain, et cetera, et cetera. So the information that you're passing on to us about transgenerational trauma and how this is carried in our DNA, how is that information being disseminated to current medical students? What is the appetite for that information, and what steps are being taken to make sure that there is education for our doctors who are coming up around this type of, trauma-informed understanding of medicine and science?
Thank you for that question. I think there's two parts to it, and I'm going to tell a very short story where I was working with a young Black man who was formerly incarcerated and was now doing work in the community to help as gang intervention to help folks get out of gangs. And he told a story of being stopped by a police officer, and he appeased. And afterwards, he was beating himself up. Why didn't I stand up? Why wasn't I a man? The self-inflicted shame and to name what appeasement was for him helped him understand that he did what he needed to do to get home safely to his young child. And it released the shame so for us to know and name appeasement helps us release the shame of the responses we need to do to survive. And once we name it, we can start to recognize when is it necessary and to what degree. Because we are so habitually trained across generations. I think of after the killing of Freddie Gray, in the uprising afterwards, there was a particular incident of a Black mother being caught on video beating her son for protesting. I will beat you before they kill you. that we have taught each other how to appease. Do not stand up, do not stand up. And so it's so deeply in us that we appease often more than we need to. So to be able to correctly represent, is this a slightly safer situation? How safe is this situation? And can I decrease the amount of appeasement that I'm in? This is a coping strategy. You can also, how do we turn it off when we're out of the situation? To have that kind of awareness and to say, okay, I'm out of this situation, name it, leave it, and reset the stress system so that we are not carrying it constantly for that allostatic load, allostatic overload that is so corrosive to our, again, our minds, our bodies, and our spirits. So I'm going to leave that there and let the other presenters answer about medical training.
I don't have a lot of experience with medical school, but what I do know is that in general, myths about race persist. And so there isn't a class that I teach at Northwestern where I don't spend at least a day on race, because I feel like it's the most important myth that is just pervasive within our society. And it's certainly true for students that are going on to medical training as well. As far as what folks are learning about intergenerational trauma and that sort of thing, I assume that that's a ways off yet. But maybe Dr. Kaufman knows more about that. I mean, this is sort of the cutting edge, I would say. Some of the stuff that I talked about with early environments and low birth weight and some of those kinds of literatures, I think have been around a little longer and might have made their way in a little bit more. But I'll let Dr. Kaufman talk about it.
Yeah, I think the education is more around the ACEs, so that I know our pediatric residents here, sort of developed a whole course. And part of, what pediatricians are learned to ask, instead of what's wrong with you, what's happened to you, but really looking at it more as a personal trauma, as opposed to thinking about kind of the transgenerational and systemic issues. I think, there's been a little bit of an explosion through the pandemic, the killing of George Floyd, that people are talking anti-racism, and the impact of that, but how that's, I don't think it's filtered down either to education or even to changes in clinical practice.
I'd like to add and call in and lift up the work at Charles Drew, which as a medical school absolutely starts their education of their medical students, definitely with an entire unit on race, on social determinants, that this is the backbone of the medical education. And I think that can be used as a model. I know that Charles Drew has an articulation with UCLA and has influenced UCLA. And I know I have participated in some of the anti-racism in medicine going back before the pandemic a number of years, where we worked with second year and did a series of lectures, came in from the community. But I really would call out Charles Drew program. The foregrounding of these issues at the beginning of the training influences the entire training period, as opposed to it just being an add-on lecture. Yeah.
Thank you. Would any other task force members like to ask a question or to provide any comments to our expert witnesses at this time? Member Gross, you are recognized.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question for Kim. So I know that in your work, you have done an excellent job of articulating things like the stress response of appeasement, helping people to see that we need to look beyond cortisol, that it's actually multiple systems in the body, that, that the first responder to the stress is not necessarily our brain doing some analysis, but it's our gut, which is like the second brain. So you've done an excellent job of doing that in your work. But I also know that there's another part of your work with the resilience toolkit that you've developed to address some of the questions that Member Holder was getting at, which is what do we do? You know, given these realities of the intersection of biology and social reality, how do we protect ourselves and how do we, give ourselves a more robust, intentional use of the stress response cycle? So given that your experience with that, and you've trained scores of people and you've taken on a number of different clients where you've helped them to deal with this, as we think about strategies for reparations, how would you counsel us about, how would we fold in approaches to managing this stress that is inevitable, at least for the rest of the lifetime of those of us here in this space? What do we do and how do we help our children? So in other words, how do we come up with a reparations plan that includes X, Y, and Z to address the reality of how this stress response cycle is operating in ways that, as it should be operating, but it is so pervasive and ongoing that it is also damaging?
I think there's a basic set of skills that needs to be offered to everybody to be able to recognize what is their own stress responses and to be able to, and we know, as we've talked about here, that this is a body-based response first because it is about survival. Our cognitive processes and even our affective or emotional processes are much slower. We're moving before we realize that we're afraid or what even happened. We're already moving. And so the ability to provide people with some basic competency and fluency in understanding their own responses and using evidence-informed, evidence-based, body-based tools to regulate stress responses to mitigate some of the ongoing, and has been expressed here, continual stress activation that we experience living in the United States. And furthermore, I'm going to say, when we are in this highly stressed state, it constrains our vision. By nature, it causes us to focus on threat. We become rigid in our thinking. We become very, no pun intended, black and white. The ability to envision and imagine the culture that we want to live in is constrained by our own activation. And so as people develop this competency to become settled, instead of when we are fighting, our solutions will be fighting solutions. I don't want to live in a fight world. I have zero interest. That to be able to provide people with the skills to settle and to dream and to envision a world where we are connected. A world where we are valued, where we are whole. And so this is what I would say, Dr. Grills, is that, providing this type of education, in very, very basic terms, if you're running a stress response that's 10 or 15 or 50% greater than what is needed for your immediate moment, and that plays over years, that is some serious wear and tear. That is some weathering. So can we mitigate that by helping people learn to settle their responses, at the same time implementing structural changes, systemic changes that loosen the grip of racism? So it's not an either or, it's a both and. And that as people settle, they're better able to implement these strategies on the systemic level. And as the systemic changes happen, it loosens the grip and people are better able to settle. And mutually reinforcing patterns at the individual, the collective, and the systemic level, right? Instead of, it's like, I call it the opposite of a vicious cycle. It's like a beautiful spiral. It goes the other way. So yes, we have systems, but there are still people who are maintaining them, pressing the buttons and pulling the levers. And so we need interventions at all levels, not just at the structural level, to make sure that the people, you can write a great policy, but that implicit little stuff that happens in between needs to be addressed by the personal development of the people. Again, pressing the buttons and pulling the levers. Hopefully that answered your question, Dr. Grills.
I want to applaud what you said, because I think it's really important, as you say, to think on those different levels. We can give people tools on an individual level, but unless we address the systemic things as well, we're not going to kind of have the impact that we're hoping for. Said it really beautifully.
Thank you. Are there any other comments, questions, or insights from our task force members? If not, I would like to thank our expert witnesses. Thank you so much, Dr. Kaufman, Dr. Kwaza, and thank you, Indim Indofo, for your incredibly informed, thorough expert testimony. I learned a lot, and I'm sure many of our task force members and members of the public did as well. At this time, I would like to go to our break, and we'll reconvene at 3 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Did you have any questions about the unfinished business?
Oh, no, I think I got it.
Good.
Thank you.
Okay. It's pretty straightforward, but that way you retain, you can keep it in order and you can just go right through it and you don't have to go through a lot of stuff.
Right after this session.
Okay.
Disappear.
Oh,
Okay. Okay, it is 3:01, excuse me. We are now reconvened.